Tonight, we step into a story that unfolds not in the grand throne rooms of European castles where kings plotted their campaigns surrounded by advisors studying maps, spread across wooden tables, or in the monasteries where monks chronicled the deeds of mighty warriors for posterity, but rather on a sun-scorched stretch of Palestinian coastline, where mathematics and courage were about to collide in ways that would echo through military history for centuries to come and fundamentally reshape how commanders thought about the relationship between numbers and victory. August 5th, in the year 1192, brought a merciless sun beating down relentlessly on the limestone walls of Jaffa as Richard Plantagenet, King of England and Duke of Normandy and self-proclaimed Sword of Christendom, who had crossed half the known world to fight in the Holy Land, gazed across a tactical situation that by every rational calculation and measure should have marked the end of his legendary career and quite possibly his life on this foreign shore far from home. From the harbor where his 35 remaining ships rode at anchor, bobbing gently in the Mediterranean swells like tired horses after a long journey, the Lionheart, whose reputation had been forged through 3 years of brutal warfare, could see Saladin's banners stretching across the coastal plain, like a dark tide of silk and steel that seemed to have no end, no matter how far his eyes traveled. 20,000 of Islam's finest warriors, men who had conquered territories from Damascus to Cairo, and who had never known defeat in their professional military careers, had converged on this strategic port city with one clear purpose that everyone understood, and their curved scimitars glinted menacingly in the heat haze that rose from sand already soaked with Crusader blood spilled in the fighting that had raged for days without mercy. Richard commanded exactly 2,000 exhausted men who could barely stand after their forced march south, including just 54 knights still capable of mounted combat after years of attrition, and a handful of war horses that had somehow survived 3 brutal years of campaigning in conditions that killed most animals within months of arrival. The mathematics of the situation were beyond hopeless by any standard of medieval warfare that had been established over centuries. 10-to-1 odds against the greatest military mind in the Islamic world, a man who had studied warfare since childhood, fighting on ground of Saladin's choosing with an army that had just achieved its greatest strategic victory of the Third Crusade by capturing this vital port city. Picture this impossible trap as it had developed over the preceding days, with the surgical precision that marked Saladin's tactical genius cultivated through decades of warfare against Crusader kingdoms. While Richard had been securing Acre 80 miles to the north and establishing supply lines for what he hoped would be the final push toward Jerusalem and the holy sites, the Sultan had struck Jaffa with lightning speed that caught the Crusader garrison completely unprepared for such a coordinated assault, overwhelming the defenders through a perfectly coordinated land and sea assault that gave them no time to organize an effective response or call for reinforcements. The port city that served as the Crusaders' primary supply base for any advance on Jerusalem, the city that made everything else possible in terms of logistics and planning, had fallen in just 18 hours of brutal fighting that left the streets running with blood. Its defenders were scattered like leaves in wind or dead where they had made their final stands, their bodies left where they fell in the summer heat, and its warehouses full of grain and weapons that had been stockpiled for months in preparation for the Jerusalem campaign were now feeding Muslim armies who celebrated their victory with prayers of thanksgiving. Richard's entire strategic position in the Holy Land that he had spent 3 years building hung by the thread of this single coastal fortress that he had foolishly considered secure from attack. The loss of Jaffa represented more than tactical defeat that could be overcome in the next battle through superior tactics. It was strategic catastrophe that threatened to unravel 3 years of Crusader gains that had been purchased with rivers of blood and mountains of treasure from Europe. Without this port connecting them to Europe across the Mediterranean, Richard's army would be cut off from European reinforcements and supplies that were essential for continued operations in hostile territory. The overland route to Jerusalem, which had seemed within reach just days earlier after the hard-won victories at Acre and Arsuf that had cost so many lives, now became logistically impossible without the port facilities needed to bring in food and equipment. Worse still, For the Crusader cause, Saladin's capture of Jaffa had scattered the fragile Crusader coalition that Richard had spent months carefully assembling through diplomacy and promises of land and glory. French contingents led by nobles who had never truly trusted the English king and who resented his authority had already begun embarking for home on their ships, convinced that the campaign was doomed and unwilling to risk their lives and fortunes in what seemed like a lost cause. German knights who had followed the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa to their deaths in the cold rivers of Anatolia years earlier were now abandoning the crusade rather than face what seemed like certain annihilation at the hands of Saladin's overwhelming forces that appeared invincible. But here is what Muslim chroniclers who documented these events carefully in Arabic could not explain adequately about Richard's response to this disaster that would have destroyed the career and reputation of lesser commanders. Any rational commander blessed with even minimal strategic sense and an instinct for self-preservation would have immediately negotiated terms with Saladin, through intermediaries secured safe passage for his remaining forces through diplomatic channels that existed even in wartime, and retreated to Acre to minimize losses and preserve what strength remained for another day. The strategic situation was hopeless by every measure that military science could provide. The tactical odds were suicidal for anyone attempting direct confrontation against such numbers. Even Richard's own nobles and advisors, men who had followed him loyally across Europe and the Mediterranean, for 3 years advised immediate withdrawal rather than risk the total destruction of English military power in what seemed like a futile gesture that would accomplish nothing except getting everyone killed. Yet this king, who had earned his fearsome reputation through 3 years of impossible victories that had terrified Muslim armies from the moment he landed, was about to attempt something that defied every principle of medieval warfare that had been established over centuries of trial and error. Richard's forced march south from Acre toward the disaster unfolding at Jaffa revealed both the desperation and the determination that had made him the most feared Christian warrior in the entire Levant region, where his name was spoken with dread. His army moved at a pace that killed horses through exhaustion and heat, and broke men physically and mentally, covering 80 miles of hostile territory in just 48 hours while under constant harassment from Saladin's scouts who tracked their every movement and reported back to their commander. Knights who normally would never share a horse rode double when their mounts collapsed beneath them from heat and overwork that pushed the animals beyond endurance. Infantry discarded heavy armor they could no longer carry in the brutal heat that felt like walking through fire. The baggage trains slowed by wounded men crying out in pain, and vital supplies that had to be protected fell 20 miles behind the main force as it struggled desperately to keep pace and was never seen again by the army, presumably captured or destroyed by Muslim raiders. By the time Richard's distinctive banners bearing the 3 lions of England appeared on the hills overlooking Jaffa with the city spread below like a jewel on the coast, his army resembled desperate refugees fleeing disaster more than the elite force that had terrorized Muslim armies from Cyprus to Cairo through superior training and equipment and discipline. The arithmetic of desperation revealed itself clearly as Richard surveyed Jaffa's defenses through his brass spyglass that he had brought from England, an expensive instrument. 20,000 Muslim warriors occupied not just the city proper with its strong walls, but the surrounding hills as well, where they could observe everything, their cavalry patrols controlling every approach route and making any surprise attack completely impossible. Saladin himself commanded operations personally from an elaborate silk pavilion whose golden eagle banner, symbolizing his power, could be seen clearly from the harbor where Richard's ships waited nervously. The finest siege engines in the Islamic world, massive machines that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds with devastating accuracy, were already positioned strategically to prevent any relief attempt that might approach from land or sea. Most critically for Richard's desperate planning, the garrison that might have supported a rescue operation from inside the city by opening gates or creating diversions had been completely eliminated in the initial assault that had overwhelmed them. Richard would somehow have to retake a fortified city defended by overwhelming force using troops who could barely stand from exhaustion after their desperate march through hostile territory. The strategic stakes transcended even Richard's legendary reputation built over years of battlefield success against various enemies. If Jaffa fell permanently to Muslim control with no hope of recapture by Crusader forces, the Third Crusade would end in complete failure after 3 years of sacrifice and suffering. Jerusalem would remain in Islamic hands forever, rather than being restored to Christian rule as the Pope had demanded. The Crusader states that had been established during the First Crusade nearly a century earlier would wither and die like plants cut off from water, isolated from European support, and unable to sustain themselves against hostile neighbors. Most importantly for European politics and prestige, Christian morale throughout the continent would collapse under the weight of knowing that even Richard Lionheart, with all his skill and courage and resources, could not overcome Saladin's tactical genius and superior numbers in the field. As evening fell on August 5th, bringing some relief from the brutal heat that had tortured both armies, both sides understood perfectly that the next 24 hours would determine not just the fate of Jaffa, or even the Third Crusade, but the entire balance of power between Christianity and Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean for generations to come and perhaps forever. Richard faced a stark choice between certain defeat if he retreated and preserved his forces, and almost certain death if he attacked against such overwhelming odds without any reasonable hope of success. What he chose in those crucial hours of decision would either crown his legend with the greatest victory in Crusader history that would be sung about for centuries by troubadours, or provide Saladin with the triumph that would complete Islam's reconquest of the Holy Land and end European presence in the region permanently. The mathematics said retreat was the only rational option that any sane commander would choose to preserve his army. Richard's response would prove that sometimes the greatest victories in military history belong to those rare commanders who understand when mathematics become irrelevant in the face of perfect courage and tactical innovation that changes everything. Dawn on August 6th revealed the tactical nightmare that Richard had chosen to embrace, rather than flee from like any sensible commander concerned with self-preservation. Saladin's army sprawled across the coastal plain in perfect order that spoke of decades of military discipline and professional training, their white and green banners snapping smartly in the Mediterranean breezes as 20,000 warriors prepared for what by all logic should have been a massacre, disguised as a siege of the trapped Crusader force that had nowhere to run. From the harbor where Richard's 35 galleys bobbed at anchor like floating coffins waiting to carry corpses home to grieving families, the sight was overwhelming to anyone who witnessed it and understood the implications. Muslim cavalry patrols controlled every beach approach with systematic thoroughness that left no gaps, while archers lined the city walls in such density that their combined arrow volleys could literally darken the noon sky when they fired in unison at any target. The port that had taken Saladin's forces just 18 hours to capture through superior tactics and overwhelming force would have to be retaken by a force 1/10 their size with no element of surprise whatsoever to aid them. But Richard had spent the sleepless night pacing the deck of his flagship and transforming his apparent disadvantage into something medieval warfare had never witnessed before in all its bloody history. An amphibious assault designed to turn the Mediterranean itself into his most powerful weapon, rather than an obstacle blocking his path. His ship's carpenters had worked through darkness without rest to reinforce galley sides with additional planking salvaged from damaged vessels and spare materials, creating floating fortresses that could approach the beach while protecting crossbowmen from return fire that would otherwise cut them down. The innovation was born of pure desperation and limited resources, but it represented a tactical revolution that would influence naval warfare for centuries after Richard's bones had turned to dust in some forgotten grave. Medieval combat conducted according to centuries of established tradition was about to become three-dimensional in ways no commander had imagined possible before this moment. The first challenge facing the Crusaders was basic physics made deadly by enemy arrows raining down from above. 60 knights, wearing 70 pounds of mail armor each, would have to wade through surf while under concentrated fire from Muslim archers positioned on Jaffa's seawalls, with clear fields of fire and plenty of ammunition. The weight that made their armor effective protection on land against swords and arrows became potentially fatal in water, where movement was restricted and balance precarious. A single crossbow bolt finding its mark could drown a knight as efficiently as it could kill him outright, by making it impossible to keep his armored head above water while waves crashed around him. Richard's solution was characteristically audacious and relied on perfect coordination between different units that had practiced briefly. The ship-based crossbowmen positioned on elevated platforms would provide suppressing fire against the wall defenders to keep their heads down, while the knights used their large shields as primitive flotation devices during the wade to shore, a technique never before attempted in actual combat conditions. As the sun reached its merciless peak at midday, with temperatures climbing past what men could comfortably endure even when standing still, Richard's galleys began their approach to Jaffa's harbor with a precision that amazed both friend and foe watching from different vantage points along the walls. Each vessel carried 40 Genoese crossbowmen whose legendary accuracy had been perfected through decades of Mediterranean warfare and mercenary service to the highest bidder. Their steel-tipped bolts could penetrate mail armor at 100 yards distance, with enough force remaining to kill, making them lethally effective against Muslim defenders whose lighter armor emphasized mobility and speed over protection from missiles and heavy blows. The psychological impact was immediate and visible in the defenders' confused reactions as they tried to understand what was happening. Defenders accustomed to fighting land-based enemies approaching on predictable routes, using conventional tactics, suddenly faced attack from an angle they had never prepared for or even considered possible in their training. What happened next defied every assumption about medieval siege warfare that had governed military thinking for generations of commanders. As Richard's lead galley grounded in the shallows with a grinding sound of wood on sand, Muslim archers unleashed clouds of arrows that should have turned the water crimson with Crusader blood within minutes of contact. Instead, the reinforced ship sides deflected most shafts harmlessly into the water or back at the shooters, while crossbow volleys from the remaining vessels systematically cleared entire sections of the seawall through concentrated fire that gave defenders no chance to respond effectively. The exchange rate was catastrophically favorable to the attackers in ways that violated normal siege mathematics that predicted massive casualties. Muslim archers exposed on the walls without cover suffered devastating casualties from accurate crossbow fire delivered by professional soldiers, while Crusader knights remained protected behind thick ship sides until the actual moment of landing, when they would be most vulnerable. Here is where Richard's tactical genius became visible through the chaos of amphibious combat that had never been attempted before on this scale. Instead of attempting a single massive landing that would concentrate all his forces at one vulnerable point where they could be overwhelmed by defenders rushing to that location, the Lionheart coordinated simultaneous assaults at 3 different beaches spread along the harbor perimeter to divide enemy attention. Muslim defenders expecting to overwhelm a concentrated force at one location, as doctrine taught, found themselves facing multiple threats that divided their attention and firepower dangerously between different crisis points. Units that rushed to defend one landing site left other approaches virtually unguarded and open to exploitation by Crusader forces who landed unopposed. The wade through the surf revealed why Richard commanded such legendary devotion from men who would follow him into situations that meant almost certain death without question. The king himself, wearing his distinctive golden surcoat that marked him as royalty, led the central assault personally, despite being the obvious target for every Muslim archer within range of the beach who wanted to kill the English king. Knights who had served under lesser commanders throughout Europe would have hesitated at the water's edge, calculating their chances of survival before committing to such a dangerous maneuver. Richard's men followed him into the Mediterranean without question or hesitation or calculation, their shields locked above their heads like scales on some mythical sea monster emerging from the depths to attack the land and destroy everything. By 3 in the afternoon, when the sun was still high and burning, the impossible had become reality that Muslim defenders struggled to comprehend through their shock. Crusader knights in full armor were fighting in Jaffa's narrow streets designed for peaceful commerce, while their comrades continued landing on beaches that should have been killing grounds covered with their floating bodies. Muslim defenders caught between the seaborne assault coming from an unexpected direction and their own tactical confusion about how to respond began falling back toward the city center in disorder that spread through their ranks. The urban geography that should have favored defenders with its narrow alleys and stone buildings perfect for archery and ambushes instead became a maze where heavily armored knights could corner and destroy lighter armed opponents in close combat where armor mattered most and mobility meant less. But then everything accelerated toward crisis that threatened to undo all of Richard's gains won through desperate courage. Saladin's main force, positioned outside the city walls in well-organized camps, began their counterstroke with the methodical precision that had made the Sultan master of Syria and Egypt through decades of conquest and careful planning. 20,000 fresh warriors who had been resting started moving toward Jaffa's gates in coordinated columns that stretched across the plain, while Richard's exhausted knights fought building by building through streets slick with blood that made footing treacherous. The mathematical reality was undeniable, even to the most optimistic observer watching from the walls. Even if Richard somehow captured the harbor district through continued fighting and courage, he lacked the forces to hold it for more than hours against Saladin's inevitable counterattack with overwhelming numbers that would crush any defense. The amphibious miracle that had achieved the impossible against all odds and predictions was about to collide with strategic mathematics that made ultimate victory seemingly beyond reach, no matter how brilliantly Richard fought or how brave his men proved themselves. The race between Richard's urban conquest of the city and Saladin's approaching relief force of fresh troops would determine whether this desperate gamble would be remembered by historians as brilliant innovation worthy of study in military academies or spectacular suicide that destroyed Crusader power in one catastrophic afternoon. As Muslim war cries echoed from the approaching army that seemed to cover the earth like locusts, both sides understood perfectly that the Third Crusade's fate hung in the balance of the next few hours of combat that would decide everything. Saladin's counterattack began at sunset on August 6th with the overwhelming force that had conquered Damascus and Aleppo and Cairo through military superiority. 20,000 warriors converged on Jaffa from 3 directions simultaneously in a coordinated movement planned carefully, their war cries echoing off the limestone walls as the greatest military mind in the Islamic world prepared to crush Richard's amphibious miracle through sheer mathematical superiority that should make victory certain. The Sultan had spent precious hours allowing the Crusaders to establish their beachhead and commit their forces rather than attacking immediately when they were most vulnerable. But his patience was strategic calculation based on experience rather than indecisive hesitation, born of fear. By waiting until his full force could coordinate their movements perfectly, Saladin ensured that Richard's tactical innovation would meet systematic annihilation rather than piecemeal resistance that could be defeated in detail by the skilled Crusader knights. Richard's response revealed why 3 years of brutal campaigning under harsh conditions had forged him into something more dangerous than a mere warrior king who relied on courage alone without thinking. Instead of attempting to hold Jaffa's sprawling defenses with his tiny force spread too thin across too much ground, the Lionheart concentrated his men in the harbor district where his ships could provide continuous fire support that multiplied his effective strength exponentially. Using materials salvaged from captured Muslim siege engines that lay abandoned, his engineers transformed the waterfront into an improvised fortress that maximized every advantage medieval technology could provide to defenders fighting for their lives. Ship anchors weighing hundreds of pounds became foundation stones for hastily erected barricades that could stop cavalry charges. Iron chains intended for harbor defense against enemy ships were repositioned cleverly to trip cavalry charges at vulnerable moments when horses were running at full speed. most ingeniously demonstrating Richard's innovative thinking. Galley masts were converted into elevated platforms for crossbowmen who could fire down at attacking infantry from protected positions with clear fields of fire. The first Muslim assault struck Jaffa's makeshift defenses like a bronze-tipped tsunami crashing against a seawall built from desperation and tactical genius rather than solid stone. 8,000 infantry, supported by 5,000 cavalry and organized units, thundered toward Richard's position with the confidence of warriors who had never failed to overwhelm numerically inferior enemies in their entire professional careers spanning decades. The sound was beyond human comprehension and could be heard for miles across the plain. 13,000 men charging across limestone pavement while screaming prayers that promised paradise to those who died killing Christians in holy war against the infidels. Defenders who had never faced such concentrated fury directed at them by so many warriors should have broken and fled toward their ships within minutes of the assault beginning in earnest. But here is where medieval engineering met strategic desperation in ways that would influence fortress design for centuries after this battle became legend. Richard's improvised fortifications channeled attacking forces into narrow approaches, barely 10 feet wide, where numerical superiority became meaningless because only a few could fight at once. Muslim infantry found themselves advancing through corridors where only a handful could fight shoulder to shoulder at any moment, while crossbow bolts erupted from 3 directions simultaneously, creating overlapping fields of fire that left no safe approach. The harbor district's irregular layout, which had seemed chaotic and indefensible to military observers, became a maze where small groups of heavily armored knights could hold choke points against hundreds of attackers trying to force through narrow passages. The exchange rates became immediately catastrophic for Saladin's forces in ways the Sultan had not anticipated despite his experience. In the first 30 minutes of sustained assault by thousands of warriors, Muslim casualties exceeded 400 dead and wounded lying in the streets, while Crusader losses numbered fewer than 20 men struck down. At point-blank range in the confined spaces between buildings, Genoese crossbows could punch through mail and leather and bone with mechanical precision that made individual skill irrelevant to the outcome. Muslim warriors accustomed to the fluid cavalry combat that had dominated Middle Eastern warfare for centuries of tradition found themselves trapped in grinding infantry battles where their mobility advantages disappeared completely and meant nothing. Modern military historians studying ancient battles carefully recognize this phase of Jaffa as the birth of integrated combined arms defense that would revolutionize warfare. Richard had created something unprecedented in military history: that no one had attempted a fortress that could move its artillery quickly, adjust its fields of fire in real time based on enemy movements, and coordinate land and sea forces through visual signals and runners. When Muslim attacks concentrated on one section of the defenses, threatening to break through, galley-mounted crossbowmen could reposition quickly by rowing to provide enfilading fire into exposed flanks that devastated formations. When cavalry attempted to outflank the land-based defenses by going around through the rubble, ship-based archers could rake their formations from unexpected angles that cavalry could not respond to effectively. The harbor that had seemed like a trap surrounding Richard on 3 sides became his greatest tactical asset that multiplied his combat power many times over. But Saladin was not simply throwing men against prepared positions in mindless assaults that wasted lives stupidly. The Sultan, who had outmaneuvered Richard at Hattin years earlier through superior strategy, was systematically probing for weaknesses in the defenses while building pressure that would eventually exceed defensive capabilities through sheer weight of numbers. Muslim engineers skilled in siege warfare began constructing mangonels within range of the harbor district using materials they carried, their stone projectiles, designed to collapse Richard's improvised fortifications through concentrated bombardment over hours that would wear down defenders. More ominously for the Crusaders watching nervously, Saladin's cavalry had begun interdicting the beaches where Crusader supplies and any reinforcements would have to land if they arrived, cutting Richard off from the sea. The psychological pressure on Richard's defenders was becoming unbearable with each passing hour of combat. Each assault wave grew larger and more coordinated as Saladin learned from previous failures and adjusted his tactics accordingly. Muslim arrows fell in such density that movement between defensive positions became potentially fatal, even for armored men running between cover. Worst of all for Crusader morale, watching the endless enemy, the mathematical reality was inescapable and obvious to everyone who could count. Saladin could afford to lose 10 men for every Crusader casualty and still achieve overwhelming victory through simple attrition over time. Richard's tactical innovations had bought precious time and inflicted horrific casualties on attacking forces, but they had not changed the fundamental arithmetic of the siege that favored the larger force that could replace its losses. Then came the intelligence from scouts that would force both commanders to gamble everything on one decisive action that would end the battle. Muslim spies infiltrating Crusader lines reported that a Crusader relief column was approaching from Acre marching south, though its size remained unknown, and could be anything from a few hundred to several thousand men with supplies. Saladin faced the nightmare scenario that had haunted his strategic planning since the campaign began months earlier, fighting Richard's entrenched force that was bleeding his army, while simultaneously dealing with external reinforcement that could catch him between two forces in a tactical vice. The Sultan, who had spent 3 days methodically grinding down Crusader resistance through patient siege warfare, now had to choose between continuing the patient approach that had been working or launching an immediate decisive assault that carried serious risks of failure. The stage was set for the kind of desperate gamble that creates legends studied by military historians or destroys them utterly and ends careers. As dawn approached on August 8th, bringing another day of brutal heat and combat, both Richard and Saladin understood clearly that the tactical maneuvering had reached its limit and a final confrontation was inevitable within hours. What happened next would determine not just Jaffa's fate as a city, but whether Richard Lionheart would be remembered by future generations as the greatest Crusader commander in history, or the king whose desperate innovation led to catastrophic defeat that ended Crusader power. The mathematics of medieval warfare were about to collide with individual genius in ways that neither side could predict or control through careful planning and strategy. The dawn of August 8th brought the moment that would either immortalize Richard Plantagenet in legend sung by troubadours or mark his final defeat at the hands of the greatest Muslim general in history who had never lost a campaign. Saladin had spent the night positioning his entire army for what he knew must be the decisive assault that would end this siege one way or another. 20,000 warriors formed a massive crescent around Jaffa's harbor district, like a noose tightening their curved scimitars catching the first light of dawn, as drums echoed across the limestone walls, with rhythms that had terrified Christian armies from Hattin to Ascalon over the years of warfare. The Sultan himself took a position on a hill where he could observe Richard's destruction, personally confident that overwhelming numbers would finally crush the tactical genius that had frustrated Islamic conquest for 3 brutal years of campaigning. Richard's response defied every principle of defensive warfare that had governed medieval combat since the Battle of Hastings over a century earlier in England. Instead of waiting behind his improvised fortifications for the Muslim assault to break against his defenses like waves on rocks, the Lionheart gathered his 54 remaining mounted knights in the harbor square and prepared for something that military historians still consider the most audacious tactical decision in Crusader history that borders on madness. 54 heavy cavalry would charge directly into 20,000 enemy troops across open ground with no possibility of retreat if things went wrong and no support available. The mathematics were beyond suicidal and entered the realm of impossible madness that defied reason. They were mathematically impossible by any calculation that any reasonable person could make. But here's where Richard's understanding of medieval psychology transcended mere tactical calculation about angles and numbers and formations. The king, who had studied Saladin's methods carefully for 3 years of combat, understood that Muslim morale depended fundamentally on the assumption of inevitable victory through superior numbers that made defeat impossible to imagine. A charge that should have resulted in instant annihilation of the attackers might instead create psychological shock that could shatter enemy cohesion before numerical superiority became decisive in the actual fighting on the ground. It was a gamble that staked everything, including Richard's life, on the power of individual courage to overcome mathematical certainty that said defeat was inevitable. The charge began at precisely 7 in the morning with a sound that seemed to crack the very foundations of Jaffa's limestone walls and shake the earth. 54 destriers, each weighing over 1,500 pounds and carrying a knight in 70 pounds of mail armor, thundered across the harbor square towards Saladin's amazed army that had never seen such apparent madness from an enemy. Their 12-foot ash lances, tipped with steel points designed specifically to punch through any armor known to man, were couched in perfect formation as Richard himself, wearing his golden circuit, led the wedge that would either achieve the impossible or provide Saladin with the most spectacular victory in Islamic military history, to be celebrated forever. The impact was beyond human comprehension for those who witnessed it and survived to tell the tale. 54 knights moving at 25 miles per hour struck Muslim infantry with the kinetic force of a medieval avalanche that nothing could stop or deflect. Lance points found their targets with mechanical precision that required no skill, while wind-bred war horses trampled everything in their path without mercy. The front ranks of Saladin's army simply disintegrated under impact forces that medieval engineering had specifically designed to make unstoppable by any formation. In the first 30 seconds of contact that seemed to last forever, 200 Muslim warriors lay dead or dying on the ground, screaming, while not a single knight had fallen from his horse or been injured seriously. Richard himself became the focal point of combat that reached mythical proportions and would be sung about for generations by troubadours. The king, whose golden surcoat made him visible across the entire battlefield, like a beacon, carved a path through enemy ranks with sword strokes that contemporary chroniclers described as superhuman in their speed and power beyond normal men. Muslim warriors who had conquered territories from Baghdad to Cairo in decades of warfare found themselves fleeing in panic from a single mounted figure whose blade seemed to be everywhere at once, cutting down anyone who stood. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating beyond what Richard could have hoped for in his planning. If Richard Lionheart, with all his legendary skill, could not be stopped by overwhelming numbers and the finest warriors Islam could produce from across its empire, what hope did mere mortals have against this demon king, sent by their Christian god? The rout began within 17 minutes of the charge's initiation as cohesion collapsed completely. Elite Muslim units that had never retreated in their lives suddenly broke ranks and fled toward the hills surrounding Jaffa in complete disorder and panic. The mathematical impossibility was becoming historical reality that would be studied for centuries as 54 knights systematically destroyed the cohesion of an army that outnumbered them 370 to 1 through psychological impact. Saladin watched in growing horror from his command position on the hill as his carefully coordinated assault dissolved into panic that spread through his ranks like wildfire through dry grass on a summer day, consuming everything. What Saladin witnessed next challenged every assumption he held about the relationship between numbers and victory in warfare based on decades of experience. As his cavalry units attempted to rally and surround Richard's tiny force to overwhelm them with numbers, the Crusader knights did not scatter as tactical doctrine demanded for survival when outnumbered. Instead, they maintained perfect formation and continued their advance into enemy territory, cutting through successive lines of Muslim resistance with mechanical precision that made their small numbers irrelevant to the outcome. Each knight was accounting for dozens of enemies while suffering casualties that could be counted on one hand with fingers remaining. The climactic moment came when Richard's charge reached Saladin's command position on the hill, forcing the Sultan himself to flee from a battlefield for the first time in his legendary career, spanning decades of conquest. Muslim chronicles written carefully later would claim that Saladin withdrew tactically to maintain strategic perspective and overall command of his forces, But eyewitness accounts describe a panicked retreat as the commander who had humiliated the finest Christian armies found himself personally threatened by a king he had considered defeated and trapped. Within 1 hour of the charge's beginning, at dawn, Saladin's entire army was in full retreat toward Damascus, abandoning their camps and equipment, leaving behind equipment worth a kingdom's ransom that could buy armies and casualty figures that defied belief even when counted carefully. 700 Muslim dead against exactly 2 Crusader losses in the fighting. The army that had seemed destined to complete Islam's conquest of the Levant was fleeing in complete panic from a force that could have fit comfortably into a single small church for a service. As Muslim banners disappeared beyond the horizon in clouds of dust raised by fleeing horses, Richard had achieved something that violated every principle of medieval warfare that scholars had documented over centuries. Individual genius and courage had triumphed over overwhelming numbers through the kind of desperate courage that creates legends studied in academies or destroys those audacious enough to attempt the impossible without regard for their lives. The question now facing both armies was whether tactical brilliance displayed on the battlefield could be translated into strategic advantage that would win the war, or whether even perfect victory could overcome the mathematical realities that governed medieval conquest and logistics over long campaigns. The Third Crusade's ultimate fate had been decided in one morning by 54 knights who proved that sometimes the greatest victories belong to those rare individuals who understand when mathematics become meaningless in the face of perfect timing and absolute courage channeled through tactical genius that sees opportunities invisible to others, bound by conventional thinking and traditional doctrine that limits imagination and possibility beyond what seems reasonable to cautious minds.